beginning of a new month and new beginnings, actually, as spring starts to at least look like it's ready to come. Nice and sunny day. It is still very, very cold, but I'm looking forward to even just having a nice sunny day. Thanks again for joining. We have a high registration today to meet and listen to our acclaimed guest, Hasan Jeffries. And before I turn the microphone over to him to share his conversation with us today, his talk entitled, "What We Should Be Teaching About Race and Democracy, Lessons from Last Year." And we all have quite a bit to share in that, I know, but following his presentation, if we have time, we'll be able to turn to the audience and have a little bit of a Q&A. Hasan graduated from Morehouse College with a BA in history, and he earned a PhD in American history with a specialization in African American history from Duke University. He is currently an associate professor of history in the Department of History here at The Ohio State University. He teaches, researches, and writes about African American experiences from a historical perspective, and has chronicled his civil rights movement in the 10 episodes Audible original series entitled Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement, where remarkable stories were told about Black Panther Party in Bloodhound's civil rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, which has been praised as the book historians of the Black Freedom Movement have been waiting for. Hasan regularly shares his experiences and expertise on African American history and contemporary Black politics through public lectures, op-eds, and interviews with print, radio, and television news outlets. He's also contributed to several documentary films, projects as a feature on-camera scholar, including the Emmy-nominated 4-hour PBS documentary entitled Black America Since MLK and Still I Rise. I am very excited to have Hasan with us, and thank you, Hasan, for accepting this invitation. We are just excited. And I want to say to you also, the first time that I heard you speak was probably in person, was on the Oval here about 3 years ago when my son was in the African Voices, the gospel group. Okay. And he said, "Mom, you got to come hear this guy." So I came and I had a wonderful experience, and I vowed that I would get you somehow, some way to come and speak with us. So welcome. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Well, Karen, thank you very much for the kind words, and especially for the invitation to share some thoughts and ideas with the group, with my peers here at Ohio State. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I want to have some slides. I kind of want to share some images. But before I do, I'm going to say to you what I say to my students. I'm still teaching virtually. I'm still teaching online. I got some little people here who live in the house, and I'm like, look, you know, in this pandemic age, while we're Zooming, feel free to turn your cameras on. You know, I understand we got different connections and we multitasking and all that, but you know, I only talk to little children all day, so I like to see adult faces and reactions. So if you have the capability and you are so inclined, by all means, I very much invite you to turn your cameras on so we can, as we dialogue and as I do the presentation. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
You should have co-hosting rights.
Yep, I see it right there. Oh, perfect. And so, as Dr. Bittis Karen had pointed out, had said, I've titled my remarks, "What We Should Be Teaching About Race and Democracy, Lessons from the Last Year." And you know, I teach in the history department, and I teach about African American history and African American history, and African American experience. And of course, this is February 1, the start of Black History Month, and just briefly, I mean, the idea of Black History Month, of course, started over a century ago with Carter G. Woodson, and it was designed to draw attention, to spotlight the African American experience. And of course, it has evolved over the course of the century from Negro History Week to Black History Month. And its significance is not only to draw attention to the African American experience, but it's that the African American experience also provides a unique prism for making sense of and understanding the American past, and as well as the American present. And I think in this particular moment, it is especially relevant to look back a little bit at the American past and the African American experience, especially along these sort of twin parallel tracks of race and democracy, because they are really front and center in terms of what we are dealing with inside and outside of the classroom today, what educators and teachers are dealing with inside and outside of the classroom, what we are dealing with, those who engage in teaching and education inside and outside of the classroom. I want to begin with sharing a little bit about something that happened over a century and a half ago in Colfax, Louisiana, which is the parish seat of Grant Parish in Louisiana, about 2 hours northwest of New Orleans. In 1873, Louisiana was one of 3 states that still remained under Reconstruction control. In other words, Southern Democrats had not, former Confederates had not taken back control of Louisiana. And in 1873, there was an election, and it was a close election. And the Republicans, a coalition of white Northerners, former Union Army officers, and African Americans, predominantly African American voters, they still maintained power. So by a small number, but it was a clear, close, and fair election. And they maintained control both at the parish level and at the state level. That upset these former Confederates and white supremacists. And a group in Grant Parish declared that they were going to march on the parish courthouse in Colfax, and they were going to unseat the duly elected officials, this coalition of African Americans and white Republicans. And they called themselves the White League, a racial terror organization patterned after the Ku Klux Klan that had just been formed 5 years earlier. And they said that they were going to oust this government by any means necessary, by force of arms if they needed to. When word of their plans in early 1873 reached the African American community, a group of Black soldiers, Black men, former Union soldiers, gathered their arms and marched down to the county courthouse. They were determined not only to protect the elected officials, but they were also determined to protect democracy. And they took up a defensive posture both inside and outside of the courthouse, and there they waited. And it wasn't too long after they arrived that this group of racial terrorists and others, members that formed a mob, showed up fully armed, bringing with them a Confederate issue cannon. They told the African American men who were standing guard to disperse. When they refused, a gun battle ensued. During the course of that gun battle, 3 of the white members of the mob were killed, and several of the African Americans were wounded. Unsure how many were killed at that particular moment. It becomes clear to the Black soldiers that they are both outnumbered and outgunned. And as a result, they realize that their only course of action at that point is to surrender, to lay down their arms, to cease fighting. And when they do, and then they come out and they stack their arms, every single one of those Black soldiers, former Black soldiers, is shot dead on the spot. And those African Americans who had been wounded in the initial skirmish, who were inside of the courthouse, are dragged outside, and each one is hanged. In all, about 150 Black men are murdered, are massacred that day. This becomes known as, at the time, the Colfax massacre. Because Grant Parish, because Louisiana was still under Reconstruction control, a Reconstruction Republican government, and because Ulysses S. Grant was a Republican in control of the White House, there are eventually indictments. Some 90 or so people are indicted for this crime. About 9 are convicted, but their convictions are overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court on the grounds that the 14th Amendment, which they were convicted on violating the 14th Amendment, is important. Cruikshank Supreme Court case, they said the 14th Amendment did not apply to the actions of individuals, only to the actions of states. So no one in the end was held accountable for the massacre of these 150 men. There to hold up democracy. Now, Colfax massacre was talked about and written about in school books in Louisiana for quite a while. In 1950, 75 years or so after the Colfax massacre occurred, the state of Louisiana, its Department of Commerce and Industry, erected a historic monument, a marker, to commemorate, to mark the event. And I just want to share with you what it says for those who may not be able to see that screen at this moment. This historic marker, erected in 1950, reads, "On this site occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South." And in those 32 words or so, we see what I call the typical response to hard history, right? And by hard history, I mean those aspects of our past that make us uncomfortable in the present. Now, in 1950, that still holds true today for different reasons, but in 1950, part of what was uncomfortable about the past was the fact that this was actually a massacre, right? This wasn't a riot. And so one of the typical responses that we have had historically as a nation to hard history, particularly as it revolves around this intersection of race and democracy in particular, is we just create false narratives. And by terming this a riot as not a massacre, we're already creating a false narrative. We're changing the story and actually shifting blame onto those who were the victims of this violence. The other thing that we do, in addition to just creating false narratives, just making stuff up, is we rationalize evil. And we see this done time and time and time again. And here, the rationalization is that near that last sentence, the last line, this marked the end of carpetbag misrule, right? This notion, this false notion that what actually occurred, this riot, the sacrifices of the white terrorists was necessary in order to preserve democracy, because Reconstruction was the hallmark of Reconstruction was political corruption, right? And so this was necessary. The killing of these 150 quote unquote Negroes was necessary in order to preserve democracy. That's rationalizing the evil. And then the third thing that we do is we just pretend that this stuff never happened, right? Historical amnesia. So you have this marker going up in 1950. You have the Colfax massacre framed as a Colfax riot, talked about and taught in Louisiana classrooms up until the Black Power era, right? Because in the 1970s, school desegregation, you got the Brown decision in 1954, but really don't see school desegregation, of course, in these deep South states in any meaningful way until the late 1960s, early 1970s. And it's not until the Black Power era, 1970s, that you actually get enough sort of Black political influence at the state level to see curriculum change, right? To actually see curriculum change. And when you have African Americans, like, you can't be talking about this Colfax massacre as the Colfax riot. Well, rather than talk about it and teach it in an honest way, it just simply disappears. And so you have students who will go through Louisiana school system and know nothing about this, right? If we can't talk about it in a way that reflects positively on white folk and reflects the white supremacy, then we're not going to talk about it at all. And so that historical amnesia kicks in as one of those third responses to hard history. Now, why does this matter? Right? Like, why am I talking about, we're supposed to be talking about what we should be talking about today? We're talking about a massacre in Louisiana in 1873. Why does this matter? Because January 6th, what we saw in Colfax and what we saw on January 6th is exactly the same thing, right? We should absolutely, and I was totally shocked by what went down a year ago on January 6th. The attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power by a mob that embraces white supremacy. That's critical, right? That is storming the Capitol. Shocked. Everybody should be shocked by. We had never seen this before, but we shouldn't be surprised, and we shouldn't have been surprised. Why? Because there's a long history of political violence justified by racism and white supremacy in American history. Colfax. Why did that white mob form and descend on the parish courthouse? Because they believed that the mere participation of African Americans in the political process rendered that election illegitimate. And that's exactly what led this mob and so many others now to storm the Capitol and to reject the outcome of the 2020 election. It had everything to do, yes, with the big lie and what Donald Trump was spinning, but that big lie was predicated on the racist belief that the election was fraudulent and the election was stolen. Where? Because Black and brown people cast ballots in Atlanta, Georgia, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in Detroit, Michigan, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The same white supremacist beliefs, the participation of Black people in a political process designed to extend and actually making democracy real, their participation renders the outcome in an election that doesn't favor white supremacists illegitimate. There's a direct line, a direct connection between what we see and what's happening today and what we have seen historically in the past. And it's not just Colfax, right? I mean, in the post-emancipation era, we see Colfax time and time and time again. Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, the undermining of, or the burning of Tulsa, Oklahoma, had everything to do with political power as well as economic power. The lynching of Emmett Till was about white men who were not only insulted that this little Black boy might have said something or whistled to a white woman, but also because voting rights and Brown had already been passed, right? So we have this long history that we just ignore. That hard history, we don't want to deal with it. What I posit this afternoon is we can't run away from it because the stakes are far too high and we're still living with the legacy, right? This isn't about repeating history. We're not repeating what we did in Colfax, what happened in Colfax. We never stopped doing that stuff, right? It's on a continuum, right? So we got to talk about, we have to think about in the classroom and why it's so important to talk about sort of race and democracy and looking at the Black past and seeing what it teaches us about the present is because we've never stopped doing these things that undermine democracy, right? And race and racism has proven pivotal in providing a justification for those efforts to undermine democracy. What should we be teaching though, right? So yeah, we could teach about Colfax and put this in context, but before we even get there, our teachers in our classrooms got to deal with race first. And we have to make sure that our students understand, and I teaching, down the road from across a few buildings away from you all at Ohio State, I get, the same kids that you get, right? And the ones that your teacher, and they walk into the class and they never heard simply that race is not real. Like, what should we be teaching our students? The first day, race isn't real, right? It's biologically meaningless. There's no scientific merit to this concept of race, particularly as it connects to sort of intelligence and culture and sort of what people do. Biologically meaningless, but it's socially meaningful. Biologically, this is biologically, socially meaningful because we've used race to structure and create hierarchy in global society for the last 600 years. Biologically meaningless, we could toss it out the window. Doesn't help us explain anything, but socially meaningful. And at the same time, of course, it's culturally relevant because in the American context, we use race as a stand-in for cultural heritage and cultural ancestry. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't, a medical meaning to these things we call race, but it really has more to do with sort of socioeconomic factors connected to culture, right? I mean, so we can't dismiss it, but that's less to do with race than sort of that cultural inheritance and that biological inheritance, DNA. But it's not but it's not that sort of race is determinative, right, of who we are and our intelligence and all this other stuff. So, but because it's biologically meaningless, socially meaningful, and culturally relevant, what we can't do is we can't fall into the colorblind trap. That means we have to talk about this stuff. And this is why it's so important that our teachers lean into it, right? And then in the very beginning, when you're talking about American history, you're talking about the contemporary period, doesn't matter. Like, look, you got to understand that this race thing is not real, because as long as students believe that race is real, right, then they will use that as the default for explaining what they see around them, right? And they will always default to it. I guarantee you, even at the subconscious level, they will default to it as an explanation. And that does not serve them well, right? Why do we have, poor communities? Well, I guess because of race, right? Like Black people and culture, and they can't do this and they can't do that. We have to get that out of their mind. And by letting them know that race isn't real begins that process. While at the same time, when it comes to racism, we got to make sure that they understand that racism is real, right? Race isn't real, but racism is real, manifests itself in personal ways that we know, prejudicial beliefs and behaviors that kids can see and understand, right? Using the N-word and all this other stuff, discriminatory actions, but then also a little bit tricky, a little bit harder to make sense of, but the structural. And that's so critically important that in the classroom, we make clear to students that prejudice isn't just a function of individual behavior, but it's very much embedded in American systems and structures. And this is why that is so important. Because if we only talk about prejudice in personal terms, then, and we frame prejudice simply as a problem of sort of individual action and belief, then the solution to prejudice is real simple. It's just simply remove the prejudiced individual, right? If that was the case in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, if the problem of racism in the most segregated city in America, America's Johannesburg, Birmingham, was the police commissioner, Bull Connor, then the solution should have been simple: just get rid of Bull Connor, which they do. And yet, racism and prejudice and segregation and inequality and racial terrorism and violence will continue on for decades, even into the present, even when you have a Black mayor, right? And so students have to understand that this is much more than just individual action and behavior. So that really has to be like the starting point for conversations and teaching, making sure our students are on this sort of baseline of race not real, racism is real, and how it manifests. So where do we go from here? What should we be teaching about democracy? What should we be teaching about race, and making sure that our teachers are clear about it, but our students understand as well? First, you got to begin in the beginning. Now, we got so many people running around here losing their mind over 1619, right? And the 1619 project. It don't make any damn sense, right? 1619 is a date, right, in which Virginia colonists purchase 20 and odd enslaved Africans, right? I mean, this is the beginning of the moment when slavery enters the North American British colonies. These colonists didn't invent it, right? They didn't invent slavery. It had been going on. Atlantic slave trade had been going on, of course, for a century. Virginia, and this is where sort of that notions of American exceptionalism, right? People can say, "Oh, you're talking about the colonists." Well, nobody thinking about these damn white colonists in Virginia. Virginia was a backwater afterthought, right? And the reason why they could only purchase 20 enslaved African Americans because they weren't getting direct imports, because it was an afterthought. Barbados was the crown jewel of slavery in the British colony. But this is important because this is the beginning, a choice that is made, and this is the beginning of a trajectory, right? That connects, that embeds two fundamental concepts in America's DNA, and that is racism and capitalism, right? These two, from the very beginning, 1619. This is why 1619 actually is important, and it's not sort of the origin of America, but it's the origin of this combination, right, of racism and capitalism, the two strands of the double helix that makes up America's DNA. It's the combination of racism and capitalism that allows slavery to thrive for 250 years in the colonies. It's racism and capitalism that allows Jim Crow to exist for 100 years. It's racism and capitalism that allows mass incarceration to exist. I mean, we cannot separate the two in the American context, and we see it from the very beginning. So that's why when we're talking about race and democracy, you got to start at the beginning and then move forward from there, because it's everything to do with this combination of racism and capitalism. When we're talking about race and racism, we can't separate it from our laws. This goes back to the structural. In 1739, there was an enslaved insurrection in South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion, in which 100 or so enslaved Africans rise up. And it wasn't the first rebellion, it wouldn't be the last. But in Stono, the brothers and sisters, they raise up, they kill a couple plantation owners, and then they make their way to Florida, trying to get to Florida. Florida was a Spanish possession, of course, and if they could get to Florida, the Spanish had already said, if y'all can get here, we will give you your freedom, because they're trying to undermine the English, right? So the brothers and sisters, they got their freedom for a little bit. They got a little excited, right? They break out the African drums and they start going. That probably wasn't the smartest idea, but they get caught before they get to Florida. Every single one who is caught is then literally murdered. Another massacre right? Heads chopped off and put on pikes, right? And I mean, it's a terrible thing. But the next year, right? Because you always had that reaction to efforts of Black freedom. But the next year, South Carolina changes its laws and they enact what they call the Negro Act of 1740, that then would be replicated in every single one of the American colonies, and then parts of it embedded in the American states after the American Revolution. And one of the acts in the Negro Act of 1740 said that any white person has the authority, any white person has the authority to stop and question any African American, whether enslaved or free, to ask them, to charge them, to challenge them, to see and determine whether or not they are enslaved or free, and if what they are doing, whatever they are doing, to be questioned about. And if that Black person, whether enslaved or free, does not submit to this questioning and resists in any way, that white person has the authority to kill that Black person on the spot without penalty. This is law. You are empowering all white people to police the color line and take the lives of any Black person without consequence. And so when you talk about, again, this is not individual behavior. This is law that then both reflects individual behavior, but then also provides a justification and a catalyst for that kind of behavior. We can't be surprised, fast forward up until the present, and you see a Trayvon Martin dying at the hands of somebody doing this very same thing, because we had seen it occurring time and time again. So this is part of our laws, the ways in which sort of race is embedded, and racism in particular is embedded in our laws. It's in our founding. This is why we got to talk seriously about sort of democracy. People are like, we don't want to talk about 1619, right? Let's talk about 1776. I'm like, okay, let's talk about 1776. Let's talk about the founding. The last couple of years, I've had the great privilege of taking students down to Montpelier, which is James Madison's plantation estate, right? I mean, it's a slave labor camp. These all were slave labor camps. James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, was an architect of the Bill of Rights and the father of the Constitution, was also an enslaver, right? He enslaves over 100 people over the course of his lifetime, never frees a single soul, nobody. The only way if you were enslaved on Madison's plantation, that you gained your freedom is if you ran away, you were sold by Madison, or you died. That was it. And Madison was not a first generation enslaver, right? He's a third generation enslaver. Third generation, 3 generations of Madisons over the course of 150 years, enslaved and hold in bondage 6 generations of African people, right? So, when we look at, talk about the founding, it's like, oh, this is just that rationalization of evil, right? This is just something they did, right? Like they were Uber drivers or something. Like, no, this was his life, right? This was the business. This is everything. This is central to who they are. And so I take the students and we go to Madison's plantation, and we go to the house, literally the house where Madison was born. But this is also the place, that room in between, right above that middle door, in between the third and fourth columns, that literally is Madison's library, where he conceived and conceptualized the Bill of Rights, right? And so as a historian, I'm bringing my students to this place, like, look, I need you to stand here, because this is a place where an important moment of history happened, right? And you got to understand the power of place. But after I take them there, I immediately take them down into the basement, right? Because if you go into the cellars of Madison's mansion, right? And you place your hands on the brick walls, eventually you will find these indentations in the brick walls. And those indentations are the handprints of the enslaved people who made the bricks that built this mansion. Because all of the bricks on Madison's estate, the slave labor camp, just like all of the bricks at Mount Vernon, which is Washington's place, and Monticello, which is Jefferson's place, they were all made by the enslaved people who worked there. But if you put your hands on those bricks, and that middle brick right there, you can see one of those fingerprints. You lay your hands on those bricks, you'll notice something. And in those fingerprints, if those fingerprints are not made by an adult, they're too small, because they're actually the fingerprints of children, because it was the enslaved children who were tasked and made to make the bricks at Madison's plantation. So when we talk about our founding, right, and this is the Bill of Rights, right? Like, this is the structure. These are the freedoms that government cannot infringe upon, right? They are literally that room where it is conceived and conceptualized, right? It rests on a foundation of bricks made by the children that James Madison enslaved. we can't tell that first story without telling that second story. Because yeah, Madison is surrounded by 4,000 books, one of the largest libraries owned by an individual in colonial Virginia in New America. But he didn't have to read the great Greek philosophers to understand what it meant to deny freedom to people. All he had to do was look out the window, because he had been doing that his entire life. And so when we think about our founding, we have to make sure that we're putting it in its proper context. So we're going to talk about 1619, but we're also going to talk about 1776 and 1787, because that's critical to understanding the story. My area of primary area of research and expertise is on the civil rights movement, and one of the wonderful civil rights songs that comes out of the 1960s era in the Southern civil rights movement is "Which Side Are You On?" Right? His civil rights activists get there, "Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on?" And they go through this whole riff: on the side of freedom or not freedom, right? Which side are you on? I take great pleasure in asking my students here at Ohio State, and they come in, right, all bright-eyed, and I ask them about the Ohio coming into the Union, and which side was Ohio on the question of slavery? Which side were we on? And the hands will go up, and they're like, "Oh, Dr. Jeffries, I know this one, right?" Ohio, came in on the right side of the slavery question, right? Ohio came in anti-slavery. You can't have slavery in Ohio, right? And they guess, right? That's the one thing I remember from history. Like, yes, I know this. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Ohio did come in on the right side of history, but for the wrong damn reason, right? Ohio was anti-slavery because white Ohioans don't want black people here, whether they are enslaved or free. Now, this is critical to understand, because we frame this question of race, and particularly racism, as being a regional thing, right? It happens where slavery is, it happens down in the deep South, and we don't make the connection to the existence of white supremacist beliefs and racism as being a national phenomenon. So yeah, here in Ohio, you can make the right decision. You could say we're not going to have slavery here and still believe deeply in white supremacy. You can be an abolitionist and still believe in white supremacy. Old Father Abraham, right, was an abolitionist. Abraham Lincoln moves gradually into embracing abolition, and he was a white supremacist, right? He's like, yeah, eventually we may have to make this a war to end slavery, but these black folk can't stay here, right? So he's looking at, well, if we do make this a war for slavery, where can they go in Central America? Right? In the Lincoln Douglas debates, he's like, no, they tried to pin him on that. Like, oh, you believe in racial equality. He was like, are you crazy? He's like, I don't believe in racial equality. Right? Now, he may have struck up a nice friendship with Frederick Douglass, right? But that doesn't mean that suddenly, he's a racial egalitarian. Now, that's important, because if we don't draw that connection for our students, that racism is something that really is a shared national phenomenon, a shared national belief, then they do not understand, when we move into the post-emancipation period, into the modern era, why racial inequality actually exists, right? They're like, oh, it's a function of black behavior. Segregation in America, in Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati, is simply a function of black failings, because white racism really wasn't a thing up here. It was always down there. So it's important that they understand that this is something that starts from the beginning. It's also important to understand that our students understand, again, race and democracy, these things will be connected, that although slavery ends in 1865, great, we needed that, right? Two things happen afterward. First, at the moment of emancipation, African Americans aren't suddenly looking around like, okay, now what do we do, right? So we've talked mainly about systems and structures, but we also got to talk about people. Students got to understand that black folk, even while they were enslaved, were people, which means what? That they were thinking individuals. They understood what was going on. Nobody, go back to Madison, nobody understood better what freedom meant than the people who were denied their freedom and yet were living in the presence of people who enjoyed it, right? They didn't have to read the Bill of Rights to understand that freedom of speech is essential to freedom, that freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. They knew exactly what was critical to be a free person in society, because they were living in the presence of people who were denying it to them, and yet they were enjoying it. And so at the moment of emancipation, the black folk, formerly enslaved folk, are like, look, we know what we want, we know what we need. And they're fighting not just for civil rights, right? The right to vote. Frederick Douglass, and shortly after Appomattox, is like, look, If black men at the time don't get the right to vote, then freedom is meaningless, right? So yeah, they're fighting for civil rights, but they're also fighting for human rights. We need our marriages recognized and protected in law. We need personal safety, right? And so I call these freedom rights. And black people, I mean, they're drawing upon their experiences in slavery and translating them into the present, saying this is what we need to do. And that combination of civil rights and human rights that they have been denied, that they look back upon and reflect. We got to take black people, poor people, enslaved people seriously as political thinkers. That forms their agenda going forward, right? For the next century and a half. So, you know, it's not in 1954 that black people suddenly like, hey, you know what? The segregation education thing ain't working, right? Like they, you know, 1865, they're sending thousands of petitions to the Freedmen's Bureau, like, oh, we need schools, right? I mean, this is all consistent, right? And have been going on. This begins the agenda of the Black freedom struggle for the next century and a half. That's part of the legacy of slavery, right? Black people drawing on their experiences and determining what it is that they need going forward. But the other principal legacy of slavery is on the white side, and that's white supremacy. Slavery ends, but white supremacy doesn't. The belief in white supremacy does not end in 1865. And so we see coming out of emancipation, white Southerners in particular, right, trying to recreate the basic labor arrangements that they lost with the institution of slavery. Right? They never give that up. The idea that they own black labor, right, that never goes away. It's just a matter of what do we do and how can we get as close to slavery as possible, but we know we can't go back. We know we lost the war, right? We know we can't go back there, but how can we get as close to that as possible? And the belief in white supremacy justifies the actions that we will see going forward. This is important because, you know, that desire to control black labor is what is driving the Colfax massacre, but and ends Reconstruction, right? Reconstruction is a failure. Reconstruction is undermined, right, by the actions of white supremacists and the loss of interest in northern Republicans. But we see after Reconstruction, and this is where, you know, in social studies we don't do a good job of this. We get to the, you know, we may touch a little bit on Reconstruction, and that's it. We don't hear from black people again until we get to Martin Luther King, right? But the turn of the 20th century becomes so critical because this disruption, this is where we connect white supremacy, race to democracy. Between 1890 and 1910, every single state in the former Confederacy rewrite their state constitutions for the sole purpose of disenfranchising African Americans. And this is this critical moment. And they're successful. Alabama, right? In the county I study in Alabama goes from 5, and they rewrite their constitution in 1901. You go from 5,000 registered voters in 1900 to 55 in 1905. I mean, the disenfranchisement is wholesale. And one of the elements in this constitutional disenfranchisement is saying if you have a felony conviction, you can't register to vote. You can't participate in the political process. That was designed specifically to disenfranchise African Americans. We're going to hit them with felonies, and now they can't participate in the political process. Virginia is still wrestling with that. 1 in 5 black folk in Virginia, 20% of African Americans in Virginia can't vote because they have a felony conviction, right? Why is that even connected to voting? Because it goes back to this moment in post-Reconstruction disenfranchisement era, which was all about the ascendancy of white supremacists trying to regain control of the South. That's important because we connect to democracy. Students have to know we got to get them to stop thinking about sort of the myth of perpetual racial progress, as though things, yeah, may have been bad once, but they always get better in America, right? It's just a matter of time. But time isn't a social force, right? Time is not a social force, and therefore time is not what creates change, right? And they'll fall into the pattern of, well, if you let time pass, things will change. No, because time is not a social force. If you don't do anything, the passage of time will only reinforce the status quo. Action is what creates change, right? And so disrupting this idea of perpetual progress means that if you don't work to create constructive change to move this nation towards a more perfect union to become more democratic, then it will not. In fact, it will regress and it will default, right, to the standard in America, which is not full democracy, but limited democracy for some, right? And this moment really makes that clear. We can never talk about the African American experience or the American experience, and particularly the color line and how it is maintained without talking about racial terrorism, And certainly lynching becomes the most dramatic form of that. We're talking about between 1890 or so and 1930, 3,500, close to 4,000 African Americans murdered in these sort of public spectacles. At its height, you're talking about, 2 African Americans a week, 2 to 3 African Americans a week are publicly murdered. And you say, wow, that's a lot, right? I mean, 150 or so African Americans publicly murdered at the turn of the century, and this goes on for decades. That is a lot, and that's insane. And it's purposeful, right? Designed to reinforce the color line. Over the last 15 years, right, from 2005 to 2020, best statistics that we have, over 350 African Americans every year have been killed by police. Every year. So that means we're talking about 2 times as many African Americans now, today, die at the hands of police than actually died at the hands of lynch mobs during the height of lynching. I mean, those 2 have to be in conversation, right? I mean, that also puts in perspective what they were dealing with then, and also what we're dealing with now. Just a couple more slides, and then I'll throw it up. I want to say some type of conversation. When we talk about Jim Crow America, we just can't talk about minor inconveniences. Certainly, the Jim Crow South wasn't just about, the unfortunate inconvenience of not being able to sit in front of a car. It was about power, right? And it was about regulating people's access to the mechanisms of power. But we also have to talk about Jim Crow America, right? The way in which northern cities are also segregated, and not just by happenstance, but on purpose, because of very specific public policies. And we can do that right here in Ohio and in Columbus, right? So we talk about Jim Crow America. When we talk about civil rights and Black power, race and democracy, this was a revolution, right? That actually moves the nation to become more democratic, that opens it up, not just to African Americans, but to immigrants, but to women, to eventually to the LGBT community. This was a revolution, but it was unfinished, right? So we have to, again, stop talking about this idea that we get to this moment and things are done, right? Like you get the 64 Civil Rights, 65 Voting Rights Act. And even at the time, you had a lot of white folk were like, what else you Negroes want, right? We got some laws here, right? No, but that wasn't the end, that was the beginning. And just as that's the beginning of a new phase in the Black freedom struggle, we got to be clear too that people understand that just as that South Carolina 1740 law was a response to the Stoner Rebellion, we see even in the realm of education that revolution being undone, right? These private white academies that emerge sprinkled throughout the South after 1965 and Lyndon Johnson getting the Elementary Secondary Education Act passed. We see all these private white academies popping up. Why? Because now we're creating a dual education system, these segregationist academies. They were saying this. We're creating a dual education system that is going to be public and private because we lost the dual education system that was public. And we will see for the next 50 years attempts to use public money to fund these segregationist private white academies. Now they get fancy in the 1970s and they become Christian academies, right? But it's the same thing, right? And this is the same heritage. And then they want to move into the charter zone, right? And so we got to be clear about what that is. That was an attempt to undo the revolution and creating a more democratic society and desegregating schools, and the anti-busing push, right? This ain't just bad Southerners, right? I mean, this is everywhere. So this is, of course, the famous image from Boston. Again, let's not regionalize the efforts on the part of white Americans, politically conservative white Americans, to maintain a very strict hold on white spaces. The Black Lives moving into the present, the Black Lives Matter, this activism, belongs on the continuum of the Black freedom struggle, right? I mean, we're seeing the same thing. So when we saw 20, 30 million people taken to the streets, led by young Black folk in particular, and young people in general, taken to the streets in the summer of 2020, largest protest in American history, right? The March on Washington was 250,000 people for one afternoon on a Sunday. We're talking about 30 million people across the country, 40 million people across the globe, demanding justice for the victims of police violence, but also calling for the recognition of Black humanity, right? That's why you saw those beautiful murals going up, right? Recognition of Black humanity, but they were calling for teaching historical truth. And this is for us as educators, this is so important because the kids are demanding it. That's why they want them damn monuments taken down. Because they were like, that don't make no sense. Like, we understand that these were monuments built to celebrate white supremacy. And you got to give us an honest accounting of the past. And so all 3 of those were really connected. And this last thing, and then I'll be quiet, the fragility of democracy. This is the moment that we are in, right? And why does this all matter? Not only because of January 6th, because, you know, obviously they were unsuccessful then. But this is as you watch the news and you see, this is the undermining of democracy slowly. You know, a slow motion coup, as so many people have said. When we see state legislatures like in Georgia passing voter suppression measures that are designed specifically to make it harder for Black people and young people to vote, that is designed to undermine democracy, right? And these are measures explicitly designed to make it harder for people to participate in the political process. And you can connect that to this anti-critical race theory hysteria, right? Which is born out of politics, right? Because it's a way to sort of animate that Trump base, right? And then has leaked into our education system. Why? Because it has everything to do, this partly that backlash, not only to sort of democracy and trying to keep political power control, but this has everything to do with the critique that came out of the Black Lives Matter moment, which was people saying we got to end systemic racism. That shook white political conservatives to the core, especially elected officials, because they're like, wait a minute, you're not, that's getting away from that individual police officer. You're saying systemic racism, the whole thing got to go. We got to change systems and structures. And it got a resonance. You could have been like, hey, Alexa, you know, what is Black Lives Matter? Oh, it's the revolution. Then people lost their mind. They're like, we can't deal with that. And so you get the critical race theory thing saying what? That systemic racism isn't real. All the stuff that we just talked about, the way in which inequality is embedded in our system structures is not real, right? So we don't got to deal, we don't got to change anything. And so the two actually go hand in hand. And so the last thing I'll say is, for educators, what's the message to educators that we have to have, those teachers that we encounter all the time, in addition to students, but especially teachers in this moment, that they got to be bold. They got to be bold in what they're doing in the classroom, because the stakes are very high, but it warrants that, right? And the students want that. But at the same time, they got to be courageous, because there are real consequences and real stakes. You know, here in Ohio and Tennessee, across the country, and they got to have the courage, right? Like, we don't take a Hippocratic oath. But if we did, you know, we got to tell the truth. We got to teach the truth. We got to be honest about the past and the present. And in order to do that in this moment, particularly when talking about questions of race and racism and democracy, you know, you got to be courageous. You know, math teachers don't necessarily have to be courageous in the same way. And it's a shame that we have to be courageous to teach honestly and to teach effectively, but we have to do it, and we have to do it in bold ways. And so with that, I'll stop sharing, and Karen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you so very much. I appreciate your time, obviously, and this message was just super powerful, very much on point and very much needed. I would challenge you though, because I was a math teacher. There are math teachers who do need to really come to some understanding how they are teaching math in very racist ways. So, but that's a conversation for another time. I'd like to open up now for the guests. If you have something that you would like to bring about or talk about or ask, Hasan, please, this is your moment. Please use the feature to raise your hand so that I can see folks.